So I'm going to just show you a few slides which sort of document some of my more recent research, which interviewed dozens of tech staff and has also discussed sort of the design of tech algorithms with many in the human rights and peacebuilding community. So I start with this slide. You know, Steve Jobs founded Apple Computers. He described computers as bicycles for the mind. So when we ride a bicycle, it takes a lot less energy to pedal than it would to walk an equal amount of distance. So, you know, in principle, computers are fantastic because they amplify our human energy. You know, we could just do that Google search like you just had us do, and we can find out all this information. So yes, technology has amazing attributes, but it's not neutral. It can be, you know, it shapes our behavior. So while it might be like a bicycle, some of the algorithms that are driving how computers and the internet digital platforms are working, they're like the roads that we can pedal on. You know, we can't just pedal in any direction. We are bound by what the platform allows us to do, and really which algorithms are generating basically roads for us to go down. So the digital design of technology really determines the direction that we pedal. Now, you know, polarization, division, those of us here at PeaceCon, we work on peace building in divided societies. We know that this was happening long before there was technology. But what is really unique about this current era is that I called it the tectonic shift in my last book. So in this age of digital tools, they really lend themselves to divide and conquer strategies. So they're really incentivizing and amplifying the worst aspects of human behavior: distrust, hate, us versus them. And some people would call this algorithmic extremism, because the profit orientation of many of the platforms are really, it's based on user engagement. So the platforms are trying to keep users on as long as possible. The algorithms show people the most extremist, emotional content out there. So it's like a megaphone on these extremist ideas. And, you know, tech companies kind of try to convince us that it's all freedom of speech, but the algorithms really are about freedom of reach. So the freedom to have an amplifier on some types of speech, and in fact, the worst kinds of speech. So we try to say, you know, freedom of speech is not the same as freedom of reach. And we know that sort of the tech companies have been trying to do content moderation. When I interviewed tech staff, they called it sort of a tsunami of traumatizing content, and really hour after hour on their jobs looking at the worst aspects of human behavior. Some called it an endless game of whack-a-mole to try to manage that tsunami of harmful content. And it's particularly difficult in the global South, you know, where Facebook, Twitter, many of the big tech companies, they don't have people really who speak all of the languages, so they can't really do proper content moderation in those societies. We know that digital hate and disinformation are spilling over into real world violence. So all this algorithmic extremism, all the hate online does translate to more division, more unnecessary. Sorry, if you can mute the person who's just joined.
Yeah, sorry, she's muted now.
Okay, thank you. The challenge also with content moderation is the tech sector has lost so many people this year, mostly from tech sector layoffs. It's now actually up to 200,000. So more tech layoffs have happened since this statistic came. Sorry for not updating this slide, but it's closer to 200,000 since the beginning of 2022. Many companies are, really downsizing their human rights and content moderation teams. And of course, we already know that the left and the right feel very differently about content moderation. In this country, the right doesn't want really any content moderation. And the left wants more for hate speech and false information about elections and COVID and other issues. But in other countries, autocratic regimes are just wanting content moderation in which you just actually shut off the internet altogether, which is what we're seeing in Ethiopia and other countries where human rights activists start talking online, on Facebook, on different platforms, and the internet is just shut down completely. In my research, I found that there were sort of three different ways of thinking about the kinds of harmful content online and online algorithms that amplify those. The first is what I call the user-centered narrative, which many tech staff kind of referred to tech platforms as neutral mirrors, just reflecting content that users were generating, noting that algorithms can demote or moderate content but cannot generate pro-social content. So even if you wanted to have an algorithm amplifying pro-social content, some of the tech staff were saying we looked for it and we couldn't find anything to amplify any positives. So the second narrative is a little more critical of tech platforms and saying actually that the tech designs themselves are generating the incentivizing actually some of this hateful content and rewarding it and amplifying it with their algorithms. At the Center for Humane Technology, they compare digital spaces to gladiator arenas like the Roman Colosseum, where, sort of a few people are at the center spewing hate and attacking each other, and most of the audience is basically just silent observers of this kind of fight. The third approach to thinking about harmful content online is to say, well, maybe we need to move beyond content moderation, beyond even just regulation of tech companies, requiring them to do more content moderation. Maybe we need to design tech platforms so that they amplify the best parts of humanity, that they support mediation and peace processes, that they support learning across the lines of conflict. And I'm going to just tip the hat here to Ravi, who will talk in a minute, but I've come to see like what we're really talking about is a shift from content governance, which again is that user-centered approach, which is trying to sort of take content offline and governments thinking about what to mandate in terms of content moderation, to I think what is design governance. So tech companies and governments thinking about what is the design of tech platforms and what are their algorithms do that really are pro-social or support human society and social cohesion. So what if we designed our digital town squares to enhance our ability to solve problems together? And at this February conference on tech and social cohesion, this is what we were really exploring, that the tech platforms that already exist that do this, and even Facebook has affordances and algorithms that help social movements mobilize for democracy and human rights. We know that there's platforms designed by computer engineers that have training in social cohesion already, and their products have algorithms that show where the common ground exists between people and can help visualize, both the differences and the commonalities in the belief systems and the policy ideas that people hold. And so these two platforms that we featured at the conference, Polis and Remesh, I can put those in the chat. These are being used by the UN, by different governments, to help the public talk about polarized policy issues. And again, the algorithms are actually incentivizing people to see where they agree, where there's common ground, but they're also incentivizing how people generate ideas. You know, sort of this idea in conflict resolution is you try to find creative methods of resolving conflict that meet the interests of all sides. So yeah, my final slide here is just, you know, there's all kinds of ways you can design technology to help people listen at scale, to take perspective, to reality test on perception gaps, to visualize where there's common ground and to incentivize that. So let me stop my sharing here. Let's see. All right. And pass it over to Ravi, who can go on with his own research on related to these things.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So interesting. Again, you know, each of your presentations just have so much more that we can discuss and talk about. You know, as you were talking about regulation, I was thinking that even when it comes to disinformation, for example, regulation alone is really not enough, even content moderation, as you were explaining, because often what happens, even when it comes to disinformation, is that if you shut down one page that's spreading disinformation, another page can just very easily be created. So as you were saying, how can we design platforms or even work with current tech companies to really re-examine the very foundations of the design of these platforms that already exist. And actually, Ravi is a great person to take us through that with his experience, you know, very wide experience. Ravi is a managing director of the Psychology of Technology Institute at the University of Southern California's Neely Center. Before this, he led data science, research, and product teams across Facebook towards improving the societal impact of social media. He helped co-found and build the initial algorithms for Ranker.com, and he holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Southern California. We're very excited to have you, Ravi. Thank you for joining us. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that we recently wrote. And so I'm going to put the paper in the chat, and then I will also do a slide presentation. So give me 1 second to set up. Great. So I think, can you guys see my screen? Yep, cool. Okay, great.
Yes.
So so the paper is on the algorithmic management of polarization and violence on social media. And it's a collaborative paper that I wrote with Jonathan Stray, who's at UC Berkeley's Center for Human Compatible AI, as well as Helena Puiglarari, who runs a peacebuilding organization called Build Up. So social media is clearly important to conflict, and it's been implicated in human rights abuses in Myanmar. It is where we learn about the war in Ukraine. It is where misinformation about the war in Ukraine spreads. It was implicated in the January 6th protest that led to violence in the United States, but it was also implicated in protests against dictatorships around the world that people would consider more just. So social media definitely has a relation to conflict, just like it does all the behaviors that people engage in. But conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, in the paper, we review the conflict literature, and we try to make a distinction between constructive conflict, which often is essential to democracy. Like we have disagreements about things that we need to resolve, and so conflict by itself is not necessarily a bad thing if it's about issues or policies that we need to come together on in order to make progress. Then there's also what we call destructive conflict, which is when conflict is no longer about the issues, but it's actually about the people. It's about defeating the other side, demonizing the other side, and that is where conflict leads more to polarization and can lead to violence. And so, you know, one thing we talk about in the paper is how social media companies often intervene in these conflict cycles when you see violence, whereas actually the conflict literature would say that these cycles of violence begin long before you actually see violence. And if you actually want to affect them, you need to think about the relationship to these cycles much earlier in the process. So in the paper, we argue that social media does have a negative relationship to destructive conflict. It encourages more destructive conflict in two ways. One way is that there always have been people in society who want to engage in more destructive forms of conflict. And social media's open, frictionless design enables those people to do their jobs better. And it enables them to manipulate large groups of other people. So you see things like disinformation for hire campaigns. You see PR firms specialize in it. You see pressure for campaigns to match the tactics of the other side. You see troll armies, right? It also enables people to harass people en masse, to harass large harass journalists in large numbers and discourage people, oftentimes minority groups or women, disproportionately discourage them from participating in the process, which just becomes increasingly ugly and increasingly toxic to participate in. So social media enables these destructive conflict actors to do their jobs better, but it also has an effect on people who would otherwise be more moderate and neutral. And so the other we cite a few forms of evidence for this in our paper. One is are the statements of these sort of neutral conflict actors, and we believe it's a little bit more than anecdote, because BuzzFeed, for example, who we talk about in the paper, when they come to you and tell you that they're incentivized to produce more destructive conflict, like they run tons of A/B tests about what does or does not work, right? So they're not just telling you a feeling, they're telling you the results of many, many experiments. Here we quote Senator Ben Sasse, who is another person who's has observed this incentive towards more destructive content. And he talks about how he's interviewed many celebrities. They try sometimes to get out of the outrage of the day coverage, but what happens is that nobody clicks, their metrics plummet, and they end up throwing themselves back into this outrage loop. So this is how, an illustration of how algorithms incentivize people who would otherwise be neutral to be more destructive. Another form of evidence we talk about is the recently, there are some number of experiments that platforms have done that have recently become public. So there's a Wall Street Journal article, for example, that talks about how some of these for Facebook actually did some tests and actually launched, to their credit, a deprecation of the optimization for comments and shares within the ranking models for political content. So some of the political content you get is a function of was formerly a function of whether they predicted you would comment on it or whether they predicted you would share it. They removed that optimization, and as a result, users told them that their feeds were more worth their time. Anger reactions fell by more than a half. There was less misinformation. There's less bullying. There's less graphic violence, right? And so there's a few other experiments that have this same flavor, where deprecating some of these engagement signals, which social media algorithms often optimize for, leads to these positive effects on society. And the last form of evidence that we cite in the paper is evidence from external studies looking at what does well on social media. Oftentimes they observe that the most engaged content is content that is negative and about the outgroup. And so if these algorithms are optimizing for engagement, it makes sense. If these algorithms are optimizing for engagement and the content that is getting the most engagement is this negative content towards outgroups, then it makes sense that you're seeing this push for publishers and politicians to say more negative, destructive things. So that is, the evidence for the effects of social media on polarization and violence. And oftentimes, as Lisa alluded to, platforms will address this relationship through content moderation. So effectively enforcing upon content that is deemed to be violating some policy. I like to use the example of fear speech as to illustrate why this doesn't quite work. So for those of you who are familiar with American politics, American around the George Floyd protests, there was this content on social media talking about how Antifa was part of the protest, was coming to your town, and you needed to go out and potentially defend your town against these protesters who were ostensibly dangerous. Now, the problem with this kind of content is that it's hard to disprove, right? You can't prove that no member of Antifa, no one who had any connection to Antifa, even if it's very misleading, it's possible that someone who had some connection to Antifa was a part of some protest in some city, right? Taking a step back, there's a recent PNAS paper showing how this kind of fear speech, you should be afraid of the other side, not the other side is evil or terrible, but you should be afraid of them, is actually more common on social media and more problematic often than hate speech. It's also, we said a meta-analysis showing that fear speech is also a very common way that people create animosity towards other people, similar to hate speech. So fear speech is you know, a problematic kind of content, but it's not always bad, right? Like we're afraid of things often for very good reasons. And you wouldn't want to, I don't know if we want social media companies legislating who you can or cannot be afraid of, or what you can be afraid of. You know, some of the things that I've worked on is like the Israeli-Palestine conflict or the war in Ukraine. And in these contexts, you know, there's reasonable reasons to be afraid of, you know, bombs being dropped on you from the other side, whatever side of the conflict you're on. You know, you know, if imagine you're saying something heartfelt about your experience within a conflict, and you might say that, you know, and we are afraid of X, Y, or Z. Do you really want social media companies moderating that kind of speech? Oftentimes that kind of tactic taken to the extreme leads to calls of over enforcement, censorship, bias. And so I don't think that regulating speech is necessarily the answer to improving social media's relationships to conflict. And what I often talk about is design. You know, I borrow this from like colleagues, Center for Humane Tech and New Public. They often talk about this idea of building codes. You know, I think it's really important that we give designers of these platforms clear guidelines about what are better practices. We don't let builders decide, you know, what is a safe building, right? We give them clear guidelines. This is what a safe building looks like. We also don't hold builders responsible for every bad thing that happens in a building, right? Like we hold them responsible if they design a building that encourages bad things to happen, or a building that is especially flammable. And similarly, you know, I don't think we can hold social media companies responsible for every bad thing that happens on a platform. You know, people are going to do bad things in the world, and you know, I don't think we want them to try to adjudicate everything that is said on their platforms. I think what we do want to hold them responsible for is when they're incentivizing more destructive content, which is, you know, the evidence that we have suggests that is true. And instead, we would love platforms to support the transformation from destructive forms of conflict to more constructive forms of conflict. So in the paper, we talk about 7 specific ideas. Some of these are just implied by some of the data I already showed you. Just removing the optimization for, you know, what I often call valueless engagement. So, and I call it valueless because these are kinds of engagement that don't necessarily indicate that you actually like that piece of content. Right? Like I can comment on something that I dislike and say like, this was a terrible piece of content. I can share something as an example of something that, you know, not to do. I often will spend time with content that I regret, right? Like if you show me a fight video or a car crash, I might look at it, but it's not me saying I want more of that, right? It's me sort of, you know, yielding to my more system one lizard brain intuitive side and not my aspirational side. So we could give users an ability to indicate things that they actually want, things that they so, you know, one thing we talk about in the paper is the idea of a respect button or an informative button, or peace builders have talked about being able to like actually indicate when a piece of content is bridging across divides. Though that would, you know, so engagement doesn't necessarily have to be bad. We could design these systems so the engagement that we're optimizing for is actually more pro-social engagement rather than just paying attention to something. We could also introduce friction so that destructive conflict actors can't just reach large groups of other people without things like negative feedback, a hit to the reputation, without the friction that privacy controls create. And so we can create the same social forces offline that keep people from lying to each other and keep people being generally fairly cohesive. We can introduce those same forces online. And, you know, one interesting idea that some of my colleagues have introduced is, you know, using some of this new AI technology, we could actually help people phrase things in more constructive ways. So, you know, imagine someone's write something like guns are a stain on democracy. Perhaps we could use some of this new chat technology to give them some alternatives. We don't have to mandate it, but we can give them some assistance about how you might phrase that in a way that would lead to more constructive conflict and less destructive conflict. And the last thing we talk about in the paper is the need for metrics to understand and incentivize platforms to make the reforms that we need them to do. The line we talk about is that in a world where it's really easy to measure engagement and it's really hard to measure societal impact, then it's, you know, even the most well-meaning of companies are going to end up optimizing for engagement, right? Like it's just basic cognitive dissonance. No one wants to believe that their baby is evil or doing bad things in the world, right? So if these platforms are their baby, they're going to optimize for they're going to believe that optimizing for their platform growth is actually good for the world. If we want a society where we're actually holding them accountable, we're understanding the effects of these platforms, and if they're moving in the right direction, I think it's up to us to create the metrics that could actually help us understand their effect on conflict. So that is my talk. And yeah, look forward to the rest of the discussion. I will figure out how to stop sharing. Cool. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Ravi. Especially with your experience at Facebook, I think it's very helpful to hear from someone who's worked in these in a tech company and has seen everything firsthand. I have a few questions myself, but I wanted to open it up for questions from the audience. In case anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand, say your question, or also put it in the chat. Don't be shy. Great. Haram?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. I think it was like quite lovely, and it is like just the whole problem of like algorithms is just very relevant right now. Like my question is, like for social media companies, it's like an active incentive to make sure that like their algorithms are, in some sense like forming information chain reactions, even if that means like disinformation, because like that's at the end of the day like boosting their user retention, and it creates echo chambers, which is kind of like great right now for social media companies in some sense. How do you think we can like sort of set up incentive structures within the economic models and the profit models which these companies already have, so that they build like more responsible social media algorithms which like don't have like these specific sort of disinformation negative effects?
Great question. Thank you, Haram. I don't know if any or all speakers would like to say something about this question.
I mean, one thing we talk about the paper obviously is just metrics. I think having metrics that, there was actually an impact. You could see the impact of the CrowdTangle top 10 on Facebook's. And so, there was a kind of a metric where I think Kevin Roos would track which content was getting the most distribution, which publishers were getting the most distribution on Facebook. And Facebook would disagree about the methodology, but years later, Facebook actually made some changes referring to the top 10 list, and the top 10 list got better. And so I think having these sort of public metrics is influential. These companies, I mean, the one thing I'll slightly disagree with is like these companies don't want to spread misinformation. Like they know it's like a cost to some degree. Like one reason why Facebook made some of those changes to political content was because people were telling them like this is toxic. Like I don't want to use your platform anymore. I'm arguing with my relatives. It's not fun. I don't want to do it. So they realize there's a cost. They just need a little help to like move in the right direction. And so I do think that like if we can sort of give them that help, be willing to give them credit when they do good things, in addition to giving them holding them accountable when they do bad things, then I think we can help move them in the right direction.
Very interesting, Ravi. I agree. I think oftentimes, non-tech companies and sometimes people, organizations in the nonprofit world sometimes can be very negative in talking about tech companies or corporations and their impact. And of course, it's true that we have to acknowledge the issues that exist. But as you were saying, I think it's also to talk about best practices, to talk about how to move forward, rather than being overly critical of certain approaches. Thank you for that. Any other questions before I ask mine? So one question I have is, most of you talked about the incentive behind the algorithms is really greater engagement. So one question I have is, how do we incentivize tech companies or designers of these algorithms to design algorithms that are not just based on engagement. I think you all touched on it a little bit, but I think this is really at the heart of it. How do you create that incentivization? Sorry.
I can take that question.
Yes, please.
We need to have more discussion on this, for one thing, because Ravi is in a good position to tell us how decisions are made within some of the big companies, but we know that from other markets, there are government incentives to be regulated, so that you have as a home builder has to have a license. Somebody who's building a platform also kind of needs to have a license and know what these safe designs are. There can be several penalties for not having that license. You can not be allowed to operate in a certain country. And some of the European Union is really ahead of us in terms of thinking about this kind of regulation. We have, of course, LEED standards in building, which are sort of environmental, social, sort of incentive structures to help companies in other sorts of markets to have a checklist of the things that they want to do so that they contribute to the wider society with investment in LEED standards of building. So the Hague Peace Data Standard, which is growing out of the Stanford Peace Innovation Lab's work and the city of The Hague in the Netherlands, is an idea about creating these kinds of LEED standards for platform designs. So that's more a reward system that governments could help set up to incentivize companies to have these kinds of pro-social designs. On the other side of the spectrum, there is a new paper, I'll put the link here, by our colleague Helena Piglarori of Build Up on the possibility of taxation on tech companies if they are having a negative social impact. So they call it, the negative externalities of tech companies on polarization. That's a brand new paper. I'll put the link down below. So there's taxation, there is incentives that they might get rewarded or tax breaks. And there are other policy ideas out there, but we know that we need to create these incentives for companies to think about design.
And if I can also jump on that
Yes,
train,
please.
I think there are a number also of ideas that could also be added to what Lisa shared. One, I think, is also maybe bringing actually evidence from countries where these algorithms have been impactful, and to kind of showcase to them, their lives actually in the line. So sometimes we have these conversations without really understanding the real ramifications of how people living in context of ongoing violence are affected by these social media algorithms. I think it's really important to bring this to technologists and say, well, look, this is what is actually causing when you're making these engagement-based algorithms, this is what it can do. But as Ravi also was mentioning, I think it's equally important to showcase evidence on when technologies make the adapted changes to their platforms and how that actually brings value to social cohesion. And I think that's something that's also very interesting to see to what extent we can be able to track that, because it's very difficult indeed in this environment to just be able to do that. But I think it's equally important to actually bring the positive value of when companies actually make the changes that are needed.
And I'd just say +1 to everything that Lisa and Christian have said. I just say one additional thing is engagement is not a goal of these platforms. It's a means. They're trying to get long-term retention. They are trying to potentially make money in the long term. They're trying to bring value to the users. And engagement is like the tool that they have. If you could give them a better tool to do that, they would use it. And so I think just illustrating in society, like I have learned a lot about how the relationship between user value and engagement. And just as we can learn more as a society, bring best practices to the companies, and also give them better tools for optimizing for things that we would like them to optimize for, then engagement is often used by like lower level people because they that is what they can touch and feel in the moment. If we can give them a better tool for those goals, then I think I think they actually would be amenable to the changes we want.
Very interesting. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I have a couple of more as well, but I want to make sure I take questions in case people would like to ask anything. Okay. Another question I had is, there's a lot of talk these days about regulations. I think a lot of you also mentioned it, or creating some kind of guidelines. There's the Global Digital Compact that's being developed. There's guidelines of ethics of AI by UNESCO. And so there's a lot of conversations around creating guidelines for tech companies and for algorithms for social media. Sometimes, I think that perhaps regulation enough, it's a question for me. Is it enough? Is just creating regulations? I mean, I work also in the human rights area. And so even in human rights, I mean, you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you have many human rights frameworks and guidelines, but it doesn't mean that countries actually adhere to them, even if they have signed them, even if they feel that, they are committed to them. And so I guess a question for me with something as, in a way, limitless and as free as social media, how much could guidelines actually do in terms of regulating content and mitigating some of the negative impacts of social media?
I can maybe start with that one. And it's really echoed one of the recent podcasts by the Undivided Attention. Tristan Harris just had a very interesting conversation with, I think, Rike Shema, who was also talking about how, in the context of the European Union, how the DSA has been able to, the Digital Services Act, for those who are not familiar with it, has been able to set the standard on at least a number of issues when it comes to regulating tech. And one of the key takeaways, just in relation to your question, I think, what the interlocutor to Tristan Harris was saying is that while regulation is not enough, it actually is important to set the guardrails that we need in terms of seeing how this field is expanding. Because if there's no regulation, it can go in any direction. And I think that rhyme itself is enough to say that we need to actually put the kind of standards in place for tech actors to know that, we are still in a globalized environment and we have values, we have ethics that need to be taken care of. And I also think, maybe in addition to that, I see that we are entering a phase where it's going to be more or less like the civil rights movement's time, and where at some point it's not just going to be about just regulating, but we'll need more than anything actually movements of actors getting on the street and saying, enough is enough. We're getting a lot of these bad or harmful social media algorithms. Maybe policymakers are doing their best, maybe tech actors are doing their best, but societies needs to stand, I think, at some point to say, this is just a problem that we need to address now. Otherwise, we are really facing collapse. And we are seeing a lot of, like, some of the godfathers of the AI, for example, field, who are really coming forward to say, well, we don't know where we are going with this. And I think at some point, it's really going to call for a societal conversation on this. It's not just a regulated space, but I think it's going to be a global engagement, I think, in my view.
I don't know if there's any other comments about the question from the other speakers.
I mean, I think regulation is a part of the solution, but a lot of the regulation I've seen has been like, there will be audits or there will be transparency, and then like an organization has to like make that an actual thing, and so yeah, I think it's all about the implementation, and whether we actually can come up with, and that's where I try to be somewhat specific, because I think there's a way that you could say like there will be transparency, and then people will give you some report that they generate. Or you could say like, I need to see the experimental data of that change you made last week, right? And so I think there's that specificity is where things actually get their teeth and become meaningful.
Yeah, and maybe sometimes if polarizations, get bad enough that perhaps tech companies really realize that the impact that is had on humanity, then maybe it will be an incentive enough for them just to create that peace, just to create that social cohesion, could be incentive enough. I'm not sure we're there yet, but it's interesting to think about how do we get to a point where just recognizing that by redesigning something, you are contributing to social cohesion, and peaceful societies itself could be a sufficient incentive. I see that there's another question, Haram.
Yeah, again, very interesting discussion so far. I think we've gone from sort of incentive structures towards are ethics and declarations sort of enough? So what kind of regulation? I think to prod deeper into that, how do you feel about just regulation in this space? How will it be different from say regulation in the something like what the FDA does, or what something like the IAEA does, with regulation in sort of their spaces? Earlier I think someone mentioned something about audits and making sort of safety checks. I think the pushback I tend to sort of see from big labs right now, particularly AI labs, is that tech lobby coming up and saying something like, this is our business, and the government prodding into it is destroying free market economics, something on those lines. So how do you think regulation in this space will have to be different from the other kind of standard setting organizations we already have?
Thank you. Don't know if anyone has any comments on that question. Otherwise,
I mean, I'd say we don't let building contractors undercut other building contractors by building less safe buildings. So there's some value to having if you have a level playing field where everyone has to follow the same standards, then I think you can eliminate some of those race to the bottom effects. So I think that the argument that companies need to do these things to out innovate each other is only true in a place where we don't have some minimum standard that stops them from undercutting each other using, in some ways cheaper tactics. Simple things like when you make a post or when you join a new app, are you default public or are you default private? Those kinds of things can add a little bit of friction to the business models, but it adds friction to everyone's business model. And therefore you don't have to worry about being outcompeted by someone who's willing to just go one step further than you are.
Yeah, well said. I don't have anything to add.
excellent. Thank you so much. I think there's I myself can think of more questions, but we are running out of time. It's a very interesting conversation. So before we turn to the speakers again for some final comments, we have another Mentimeter exercise, and I will turn it to my colleague Gabriela, who will explain it.
Thank you. So I will share my screen again. We will go back to the same Mentimeter, and we're going to ask a final question. So this is everybody is involved. So take a minute to think about 3 keywords of possible technical and social solutions for using social media algorithms to promote social cohesion. So take a minute to think about that, and then you'll have a chance to see on the screen sort of how everybody's thinking and how that comes together. So I'll give you a minute or 2.
Yeah, and feel free to think about some of the comments and some of the solutions that the speakers also shared with us today.
great seeing all of the different comments and ideas coming in. All very different and similar, and give it a minute or two more for people to put in their final thoughts. All right, I think this looks great, and I think everyone's had some great ideas. Oh, we have a couple more. But I will pass it off now with our very few minutes left to my colleague Simin, who will wrap things up.
Thank you so much. I wish there was more time to actually go through each of these words in terms of people put out, so we can also hear about what you're thinking about these solutions. Very interesting. So we just have a few minutes left. I wanted to give the floor back to the panelists in case you have any more final comments to share with us. It's been super interesting, and I'm sure there's much more to say. So I will pass it. Maybe I'll go the other order this time. I will start with Ravi. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just would say that, there's always going to be more that we need to learn. And so sometimes people use the excuse that we don't know everything to suggest that we can't do anything. And I do think there are things we know, and of course there's more to learn, but there are things we know about social media's relationship to, conflict outcomes, to content that, is destructive, or most people would say is destructive, that labs around the world have found is destructive. And there are specific design changes that companies could make to make their platform safer. And they don't just apply to my former employer, they apply to YouTube, they apply to TikTok. And so I think, the more that we as a society can push for those specific things and act on the things we know, and not let the fact that we don't know everything paralyze us from asking for anything, I think the more that we'll get the social platforms that we want.
Thank you so much. Lisa, you'll always be in the middle. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would echo what has been said. I think we do know enough already to say content moderation, is very problematic in a number of ways. I don't think we are reaching nearly the scale it would need to happen on in order to actually make an impact. People are very polarized over what kind of content moderation should happen. And really, it's not just that humanity is terrible and is posting all this stuff on technology. The technology is gearing us to be our worst selves. I speak from experience of saying things online that I wish I hadn't said. So I think that we need to be thinking about incentivizing our better angels, our best selves, or the most pro-social behaviors. Because human beings respond to design prompts. We have roads which tell us where to drive and not to drive, and how to do a variety of different things. There's guidelines in society that are provided for us. So it's been an age of the Wild West, sort of no rules, no guidance for technology companies. And that period needs to come to an end, and we need to understand that these are very powerful machines, and they can help us be better. And we have to learn how to build them. They'll build these machines so that they're helping humanity more than hurting. Thanks.
Thank you. Very powerful words, Lisa. I'll pass it on to you now, Christian.
Yes, just also adding to what Lisa shared and Ravi, I think one of the key takeaways, again, trying to bring some of the words that I learned from Tristan Harris in one of the podcasts that he has on Undivided Attention. He talks about the 3 principles of tech, and they were just really looking more broadly, where should tech be thinking when it comes to having commonly shared standards of developing future tech. And one of the key principles is, again, the responsibilities. And again, when it comes to social media algorithms, for those who are developing them, it's good for them to think about who are going to be responsible in managing these algorithms once they get into the public. And then also the second principle here is what kind of problems are they going to create once they're out there? And it seems to me like a lot of the challenges we are facing with social media algorithms are kind of a shocker to a lot of us, including technologists, because we did not think preemptively of what problems are we creating. And then lastly, I think one framing of Tristan Harris is what kind of coordination that is multi-stakeholder and that is cross-border. And again, hinting to the point that I raised earlier, that we need to have this conversation with people in the global south. And I think if we are really trying to really find solutions that are sustainable in the long term, it has to be a two-way process of engaging in this conversation, global north, global south. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've really, really enjoyed it. And I hope that this is a conversation that can continue. I think as everybody has been confirming, you know, this social media has such an immense influence on how we see the world. It has an immense influence on, for example, social activism, in people creating change in oppressive countries. And it's been used for positive causes many, many times. And here we've really had this very interesting conversation about how can it look at also impacting positively societies where there's polarization, where there's conflict, at least not exacerbate already existing polarizations, but also contribute to building environments that are peaceful and that allow everybody to contribute equally. I think this is a conversation that needs to be ongoing, and I don't want to keep you any longer. And thank you so much for joining us. I know you're all very, very busy, and we hope to be in touch. Thank you so much, everybody, also for joining our event.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Good
Bye.
talking to everyone. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.